The Haunted House. From the book Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, a folklore tale retold by Alvin Schwartz, narrated by me, OperatorPlays. One time, a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in a settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they always would get scared out by the haunt. The preacher took his Bible and went to the house. He went inside, built himself a strong fire, and lit a lamp. He sat down and began reading the Bible. Then, just before midnight, he heard something start up in the cellar. Walking back and forth, back and forth. Suddenly, it sounded like someone was trying to scream, but had been choked off. Sounds of thrashing, struggling filled the room, and finally, everything went quiet. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped up and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back, easy-like, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened the Bible and continued reading his verses. Some time had passed before he laid the book on his chair and got up to mend his fire. The haunt started walking again, and step, 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 up the cellar stairs. The old man sat watching the door, seeing the doorknob turn and the door creep open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said with a quivering voice, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed, like she didn't know what to do, before she faded out of sight. The old preacher waited and waited, frozen with fear. And when he didn't hear any more noises, he went over and quickly shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he thought himself a brave man and believed he'd be able to see it through the night. So, he turned his chair to where he could watch the door, and he sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the haunt start up again, slowly. Step, 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 closer and closer. Step, step, and he was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible up before him. Then the knob slowly turned and the door opened wide. This time, the preacher spoke calmly, "In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are you, and what do you want?" The haunt drifted right across the room, straight to him, and took hold of his coat tightly. It was a young woman that looked about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled, and the flesh was dropping off her face, so you could see the bones and parts of her teeth. She had no eyeballs, but there was a sort of blue light way in the back of her eye sockets. And she had no nose to her face. Then she started to speak. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind, floating around the room like smoke. She spoke of how her lover had killed her for her money and buried her in the cellar, though he had never found where her cash was hidden. She said if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she would rest. She then told him to take the end joint of the little finger from her left hand and to lay it in the collection plate at the next church meeting, and with that, the murderer would be revealed. If you come here once more after that, you shall hear my voice at midnight, and I will tell you where my money is hidden. You may give it to your church." The haunt sobbed like she was tired, and she sunk down towards the floor and was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard the following day. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate, and when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at the bone, trying to get it off. He then began screaming madly, as if he was losing his mind. Shortly after, he confessed to the murder, and they took him to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to the house one midnight, and the haunt's voice told him to dig under the hearth. He did, and he found a large sack of money. Shortly thereafter, the money was donated to the church, and all was well. However, one thing still bothered the priest. Where that haunt had grasped onto his coat, the print of those bony fingers was burned right into it. It never did come out.